Welcome to another Bio 151 lecture. A few announcements before we get started. Sapling Chapter 46 and 47 are due on Sunday by 11:59 p.m. Office hours via Zoom are on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 1 to 3 p.m. Today we're going to be talking about climate and how it affects different ecosystems or biomes around our planet. And in this picture we have the boreal forest, which is a biome that consists of vegetation primarily of cone-bearing, needle-leaf, evergreen trees. And boreal forests are typically found in northern regions characterized by long winters and moderate to high annual precipitation. Another biome is the deep ocean. Now, the deep ocean floor in this picture might look like a very barren place, but life still thrives here even without sunlight. And life thrives by feeding off of particles of food that fall from the surface hundreds of meters above. Sometimes there's a buffet that reaches the ocean floor. So in this picture, this is a whale carcass. And whenever there's some large meal like this that falls to the ocean floor, many different organisms can feed on it. So here you can see we have hagfish, which if you remember from our animal diversity lecture, are jawless fish. Remember, there are our earliest vertebrates. We have squid, you can see some bacteria growing, and there's many other smaller organisms that you cannot see in this picture. Scientists have discovered close to 200 different species that have only been found on whale carcasses in the ocean depths. So this is one of our most understudied biomes on our planet. We don't know that much about it compared to some of the other biomes. The biosphere is all areas of life inhabited by Earth, which encompasses almost our entire planet. Biomes are broad geographical areas with similar sets of communities, which are typically determined by the vegetation that's found within these regions. Climate exerts a major influence on the nature and distribution of biomes across the globe. And just to make sure that we're clear on the difference between climate and weather, climate can be thought of as a long-term average weather. So for example, you might have said, oh, it's sunny outside today. That is the weather. But the climate would be, what is it generally like this time of the year over long periods of time? So we can say in April, it's typically spring, late spring turning into early summer, and that's the climate because that's what is long-term happening during this time in our region. So in order to understand the different biomes, we first have to understand how climate works on our planet. The principal control of Earth's surface temperature is the angle at which solar radiation strikes the surface of the Earth. Earth is considered the Goldilocks planet in our solar system. It's just the right distance from the sun so that in conjunction with the greenhouse effect of the atmosphere, solar radiation maintains surface temperatures that can keep water in its liquid form. So Earth is not too hot where the water is always in a vapor form or gas, and it's not too cold so that water is always ice. So we are in that perfect place in the solar system where water can be in its liquid water form. Earth is hot near the equator and cold at the poles. This temperature distribution reflects incoming solar radiation. Sunlight strikes equatorial regions directly, but at higher latitudes, Earth's surface is tilted at an angle to incoming radiation. At higher latitudes, temperature is not only lower, but it also exhibits greater variation throughout the year. This seasonality reflects a second feature of Earth as a planet, which is that Earth's axis of rotation is not oriented perpendicular to the sun, but rather it tilts at an angle of 23.5 degrees. So we can see here that at the equator at 0 degrees, we have warmer temperatures, and at the poles, as we move towards our poles, it gets colder. Since Earth's axis of rotation tilts at an angle of 23.5 degrees, most parts of the globe experience seasonal variations in temperature. And we're used to this where we live because we have 4 seasons. The tilt results in solar radiation striking North America and Europe, or the Northern Hemisphere, more directly in July than it does in January. So warmer temperatures occur in July. So where we're at in Kentucky, we have our summer months in July. We have our winter months in January. The opposite is true for the Southern Hemisphere, where the solar radiation strikes more directly in January. So their seasons are flipped. So they have summer in January and winter in July. These patterns of temperature variation go a long way toward explaining the geographic distribution of biomes across the globe. Wind patterns play an important role in how heat is distributed across our planet. The gas molecules that make up air are constantly in motion. When they're heated, they move faster, and unless confined in some way, the volume of air expands. For this reason, warm air is less dense than colder air, and it rises through the atmosphere. The rise of warm air is particularly strong at the equator, which you can see here in this picture. We have warm air that's rising from the equator. The air is cool as it rises, and once it reaches an altitude of approximately 10 to 15 kilometers above Earth's surface, the air no longer continues to rise, but it spreads out towards the pole, continuing to cool as it goes. Eventually, at about 23 to 30 degrees, so here in the north and here in the south, this cooling air becomes dense enough to sink back down to the surface. This air continues to move along Earth's surface, some of it moving towards the poles, while the rest of it moves back to the equator. So you can see here, if we're looking at the southern hemisphere, we have this cooling air that's coming back to the surface, and some of it is moving towards the equator, while some of it is moving towards the poles. The warm air then again expands upward, cool air moves in to replace it, and we experience this movement as wind. Because Earth rotates in a counterclockwise direction, moving from east to west, in the course of one daily rotation, a spot at the equator will move through a distance equivalent to the planet's circumference, which is nearly 25,000 miles. Points at higher or lower latitudes travel a shorter distance in a single rotation. Therefore, in a period of 24 hours, a point at the equator will have traveled farther than a point at a higher or lower latitude. That is, the point at the equator actually is moving more quickly than the points closer to the poles. As the wind moves air north and south from the equator, the land beneath it is also rotating to the east, but it's rotating at a slower speed than the land at the equator. The wind then appears to be deflected to the right in the northern hemisphere, and the winds in the southern hemisphere deflect to the left. And this phenomenon of the winds deflecting is called the Coriolis effect. In conjunction with the cells of rising and descending air masses as they warm and then cool, it explains the pattern of prevailing winds that we saw on the previous slide. And we're going to watch a video that explains this in more detail.
In this animation, we're going to look at global wind patterns and talk about the reasons why the air circulates the way it does, and also patterns of rising and sinking air and how that relates to precipitation. The engine that drives it all, I guess you could say, is the intense heating by the sun that occurs in the equator areas where the sun is shining at a very high angle of incidence. And this hot air near the equator, being less dense, rises upward. It rises upward and it moves toward the poles, and then it gradually sinks at about 30 degrees north and south latitude. So we create these big spinning circles of air that we call the Hadley cells. Now, near the equator where the air is rising, it loses its ability to hold moisture, and you get a band of high rainfall and low pressure because there's air leaving the equator. Where the air sinks in these belts at around 30 degrees north and south, you get high pressure sinking air, which creates areas of clear skies and desert climates. Now, as this air circulates and tries to flow back toward the equator along the surface of the Earth, or as some of it heads toward the North Pole or toward the South Pole, the Coriolis effect, the spin of the Earth, causes it to bend and turn, and it's going to create the two big wind belts that prevail on our Earth, 2 out of 3, the trade winds, northeast trade winds and southeast trade winds, and then the prevailing westerlies. Now these winds curve, and the way they do because of the Coriolis effect. The winds curve to the right of their path, north of the equator. They curve to the left of their path, south of the equator, and they end up flowing from east to west or from west to east. Now the other big factor is what's happening at the poles. At the poles, the air is cold, and the cold air wants to sink. And as that cold polar air sinks, it heads toward the equator, and it bumps into this air heading toward the pole here and toward the South Pole here. And it creates an area of rising air, and again, rising air produces high precipitation belts at about 60 degrees north and about 60 degrees south latitude. At the poles themselves, the precipitation is quite modest because the air is sinking, and that creates low precipitation.
Okay, so I hope that this video was helpful in seeing how the winds are actually moving around the planet. Some important things that he mentioned is that at the equator, as this warm air is rising and then cools, we have high areas of rainfall. So we have high areas of rainfall at the equator, which is why we have tropical rainforests at the equator. He also mentioned, you can see here, at these latitudes up here, where our cold polar winds are coming down to meet with warmer winds, we also have high areas of rainfall. So up here, and also it's the same down in the southern hemisphere. These high areas of rainfall at these higher latitudes are what allow for there to be temperate rainforests. So even though it's a cooler climate, you still have large areas of rain. At about 30 degrees in the north and southern hemispheres, this warm air is going to suck up all of the water moisture in the air. And so these areas are areas where we find deserts. All right, and now our first question for today. What physical properties of the Earth best explain why there are different seasons? A, one side of the Earth does not face the sun for half of the day. B, the Earth rotates at a slight angle on its axis. C, the elliptical orbit of the Earth causes seasons. Or D, seasons are caused by the dominant primary producers in any given area. So pause the video and answer the first question below. All right, now we have another question. Consider the figure below. If the Earth spun on an axis that was perfectly perpendicular to the equator, instead of at this 23.5 degree tilt, how might this affect the light at the Arctic Circle, which is at the poles? A, there would be fewer days where there was no solar radiation at the Arctic Circle. B, the land area where no solar radiation occurred would be reduced relative to its current area. Or C, solar radiation would strike the Arctic Circle every day. So pause the video and answer the second question below. Wind currents are not the only thing that are affecting the different biomes on our planet. Ocean currents also play a role. Winds, those wind currents that we just learned about, in turn push water on the ocean's surface, directing surface currents as you can see in this picture. Water can carry much more heat than air can, so ocean currents transport a great deal of heat to higher latitudes. The heat it carries helps keep the northwestern Europe much warmer than the land at equivalent latitudes in North America. And you can see this here by looking at the Gulf Stream, which turns into the North Atlantic Stream. So we have this warm water that is basically slingshotted through the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean up the coast of eastern North America. It goes across the Atlantic Ocean over to Europe. And you'll see when we talk about primary productivity in the oceans that this Gulf Stream into the North Atlantic Stream is a very high area of primary productivity, which remember means that there is a lot of photosynthesis happening. And that's because of the ocean's ability, water's ability to carry more heat than air. Just as colder air sinks below warmer and less dense air, cold waters sink beneath less dense water masses. At high latitudes, the sinking cold waters begin to move slowly along the seafloor towards the equator. This results in a complex, three-dimensional circulation of water through Earth's oceans that plays an important role in the determination of regional climates. And to help you see how ocean currents cycle around the globe, we're going to watch a video.
In 1992, a cargo ship carrying bath toys got caught in a storm. Shipping containers washed overboard, and the waves swept 28,000 rubber ducks and other toys into the North Pacific. But they didn't stick together. Quite the opposite. The ducks have since washed up all over the world, and researchers have used their paths to chart a better understanding of ocean currents. Ocean currents are driven by a range of sources: the wind, tides, changes in water density, and the rotation of the Earth. The topography of the ocean floor and the shoreline modifies those motions, causing currents to speed up, slow down, or change direction. Ocean currents fall into two main categories: surface currents and deep ocean currents. Surface currents control the motion of the top 10% of the ocean's water, while deep ocean currents mobilize the other 90%. Though they have different causes, surface and deep ocean currents influence each other in an intricate dance that keeps the entire ocean moving. Near the shore, surface currents are driven by both the wind and tides, which draw water back and forth as the water level falls and rises. Meanwhile, in the open ocean, wind is the major force behind surface currents. As wind blows over the ocean, it drags the top layers of water along with it. That moving water pulls on the layers underneath, and those pull on the ones beneath them. In fact, water as deep as 400 meters is still affected by the wind at the ocean's surface. If you zoom out to look at the patterns of surface currents all over the Earth, you'll see that they form big loops called gyres, which travel clockwise in the northern hemisphere and counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. That's because of the way the Earth's rotation affects the wind patterns that give rise to these currents. If the Earth didn't rotate, air and water would simply move back and forth between low pressure at the equator and high pressure at the poles. But as the Earth spins, air moving from the equator to the North Pole is deflected eastward, and air moving back down is deflected westward. The mirror image happens in the southern hemisphere, so that the major streams of wind form loop-like patterns around the ocean basins. This is called the Coriolis effect. The winds push the ocean beneath them into the same rotating gyres, and because water holds onto heat more effectively than air, these currents help redistribute warmth around the globe. Unlike surface currents, deep ocean currents are driven primarily by changes in the density of seawater. As water moves towards the North Pole, it gets colder. It also has a higher concentration of salt, because the ice crystals that form trap water while leaving salt behind. This cold, salty water is more dense, so it sinks, and warmer surface water takes its place, setting up a vertical current called thermohaline circulation. Thermohaline circulation of deep water and wind-driven surface currents combine to form a winding loop called the global conveyor belt. As water moves from the depths of the ocean to the surface, it carries nutrients that nourish the microorganisms which form the base of many ocean food chains. The global conveyor belt is the longest current in the world, snaking all around the globe. but it only moves a few centimeters per second. It could take a drop of water 1,000 years to make the full trip. However, rising sea temperatures are causing the conveyor belt to seemingly slow down. Models show this causing havoc with weather systems on both sides of the Atlantic, and no one knows what would happen if it continues to slow or if it stopped altogether. The only way we'll be able to forecast correctly and prepare accordingly will be to continue to study currents and the powerful forces that shape them.
So hopefully that video was helpful in helping you understand the three-dimensional circulation of water around Earth. And the story about the rubber ducks is true. So the combination of air and water affects rainfall patterns. Warm air can carry more water vapor than cool air. Warm air at the equator carries a great deal of water vapor. As it rises and the air cools, the amount of water vapor it can carry decreases. As a result, the vapor condenses and it rains like we saw in that video, the first video. The air descending at about 20 to 30 degrees latitude north and south warms as it sinks. It takes up water vapor rather than releasing it. Aridity results, which cause deserts. So just again to reiterate what we learned earlier, these subtropical highs are where we typically see deserts. So for example, here in Africa, this is where we see the Sahara Desert. And then we see here in our equatorial low, our tropical rainforest, and our subpolar lows are where we tend to see our temperate rainforests. Rainfall is not just affected by wind. Topography, or the placement of different features on the planet, also affect rain. Regional precipitation, either rain or snow, are actually more complicated, and we can look at this precipitation map for Washington State to help us understand how topography can affect rainfall. So if we see here in our map of Washington, we have very wet regions on the Pacific Ocean side of the Cascade Mountain Range. But on the inland side of the Cascade Mountain Range, it's very dry. And this is because this inland side of the Cascade Mountain Range is called a rain shadow. And in a rain shadow, what happens is you have air picking up moisture. This wet air moves from the ocean up the mountains. As it moves up to a higher latitude or higher elevation, it cools, releasing its moisture as precipitation. So here we can see this is happening on the coastal side of the mountain. Moving past the mountain, the air masses descend and they warm as they go, taking up water vapor. Because they're taking up that water vapor, there is no precipitation, and for this reason, land on the rain shadow side of the mountain are very arid. So here's a schematic of one, and you can see that this is mapped via rainfall patterns for Washington State, and this is a picture of Hawaii, and you can see the rain shadow that is on this side of the mountain where it's very dry, barren, and arid, but on this side of the mountain range, it's actually very lush and green. So that is a way that topography can affect rainfall. So just to reiterate, biomes are broad geographic areas with similar sets of communities. In general, regional climate reflects the interactions among solar radiation, global patterns of circulation, and Earth's varying topography. Biomes, in turn, reflect these variations in climate. Terrestrial biomes are recognized by their characteristic communities, most visibly their vegetation. Remember, when we were talking about how to calculate biodiversity in earlier lectures this semester, typically we would count the number of plants because they don't move. So we also, in terrestrial biomes, can use the vegetation types to help us categorize different areas of land. The vegetation reflects the evolutionary adaptations of plant form and physiology to the particular climate of that region. So in that way, terrestrial biomes reflect the distribution of climate on our planet. So this map is showing you the different terrestrial biomes that we have on our planet. And they range from things such as tropical rainforests, like the Amazon rainforest, and you can see it matches right along the equator. Our tropical rainforests are in these areas of high rain. We have savannas. So savannas, you think of such as the savannas where the wildebeest and zebras and giraffes and lions and cheetahs, oh my, all live. We have our regions you can see at 30 degrees on both the northern and the southern hemispheres, where we have our deserts. So remember, our deserts happen because the warm air, the cold air is coming down and it's becoming warmer, and as the warmer air comes down, it takes up that water vapor, so rain can't happen. And you can see we have various patterns of different biomes. So the tundra is in higher latitudes in the northern hemisphere, so it's very cold. So we have a mix of different biomes within the United States, which is pretty cool. We live in the deciduous forest biome. So let's look at the relationship of temperature and rainfall in our different terrestrial biomes. So on our x-axis, we have average temperature ranging from very warm to very cold. And remember, 0 degrees Celsius is freezing. And on our y-axis, we have annual precipitation in centimeters, going from 0 precipitation all the way up to a high amount of precipitation. And so we can look at these different biomes and classify them based on their average temperature and precipitation. So for example, tropical rainforests are a biome that has a high temperature and the highest amounts of precipitation. Temperate rainforests have lower temperatures compared to tropical rainforests, but still have high levels of precipitation compared to the other biomes. And remember, these temperate rainforests tend to be where that cold polar air is meeting the rest of the circulating air, and so we have high levels of rain. We have areas such as the tundra, which are our coldest in temperature and have very low amounts of rain. Our subtropical desert would be something such as the Sahara Desert, which is very warm, but does not receive very much rain at all. And here we are in the temperate deciduous forest, where we're at a medium amount of precipitation and a medium temperature range. But you can see that some of these have ranges that are pretty wide. So we can go from being at approximately almost 20 degrees Celsius and having about 225 centimeters of rain per year, all the way to being down to close to freezing and having very little amount of rain per year. But because of our vegetation is similar across this entire expanse, we consider it one biome. Terrestrial biomes are not our only biomes. We also have aquatic biomes. So aquatic biomes reflect climate, the availability of nutrients and oxygen, and the depth to which sunlight penetrates through water. Remember, at the beginning of the lecture, I showed you a picture of the deep ocean biome, which does not receive any sunlight. In shallow aquatic environments, such as lake margins and coastal marine settings, much plant, algal, and animal debris accumulates in sediments, which supports a wide amount of bacterial growth. Grazers, such as snail and fish, feed on these plants and algae, while single-celled protists and microscopic animals called zooplankton consume phytoplankton that float in the water. As on land, secondary consumers, such as other fish or squid, then feed on these grazers, adding complexity to the food web. Aquatic biomes cover 75% of Earth, and they're broken down into two main groups. Freshwater, which covers 3% of the water on our planet, and those biomes include lakes, ponds, rivers and wetlands, and then marine biomes, which cover 97% of the water on our planet. And these are estuaries, coral reefs, intertidal zones, and open oceans. So time for another question. Which of the following does not contribute to high rainfall in the tropics at the equator? A, the ability of warm air to hold more moisture than cool air. B, density of air at different temperatures. C, evapotranspiration rates. Or D, all of these answer choices are correct. So pause the video and answer the third question below. All right, another question. Consider the characteristics of terrestrial biomes. Would you expect more biomass in a trophic pyramid from the tropical rainforest compared to one in the taiga or boreal forest? A, yes, because there is higher productivity at the equator than at the poles. B, yes, because there are higher numbers of predators at the equator than at the poles. C, no, because there are photosynthetic organisms in both biomes that support the trophic pyramids. Or D, no, because there are other producers at the poles that don't require sunlight to make up the difference in biomass that would be there if only sunlight were used as an energy source. So pause the video and answer the fourth question below. All right, that question was kind of a lead up to what we're going to talk about now, which is patterns of primary productivity across the globe. Global patterns of primary productivity reflect planetary scale variations in climate and nutrient availability. In terrestrial habitats, which you can see in this first map up top, warm and wet climates near the equator support highly productive forests, whereas dry habitats and cold environments with limited growing seasons have lower levels of primary productivity. So you can see on this map, the more red an area is, the higher the annual primary productivity. The more purple, blue and purple it is, the lower the amount of primary productivity. So you can see in areas where we have our tropical rainforests, we have the highest amount of primary productivity in terrestrial habitats. As we move towards the poles where it gets colder, we have more seasonality, so we have a summer and a winter and fall and spring. And so we have a shorter growing season for plants because most plants do not grow during the winter. And so they have lower levels of primary productivity. And if you remember when we watched the video about carbon dioxide cycling around the planet, we saw how that changed in the northern hemisphere over the course of the year based on the seasons. In the ocean, which we can see down here, first thing to notice is that the annual primary productivity is much lower overall than it is on in our terrestrial habitats. In the oceans, the relationship between nutrient availability and the global climatic zones is not so clear because remember, we have that really complicated three-dimensional circulation of ocean patterns around the globe. And another factor to remember is that in aquatic ecosystems, water is not a limiting factor to photosynthesis where it is in places such as desert habitats, such as in the Sahara Desert. The principal pattern shown in the oceans for primary productivity is one of high photosynthetic rates along the margins of continents, and especially low rates in the central gyres of the circulating oceans. The rates of primary production are higher near continents because runoff of nitrogen and phosphorus from the continents supplies abundant nutrients to the organisms living in the ocean. Upwelling zones, where nutrient-rich deep waters return to the surface, are also regions of high primary productivity. So if we look here, we see our areas in red are predominantly around our coastal waters. But like I said, when we talked about our Gulf Stream North Atlantic current, the cold water here slingshots across the Gulf of Mexico and then goes up along the eastern coast of North America. And with it, it takes warm water and some nutrients, which then feed other organisms. And this warm water helps there to be a high amount of primary productivity, even though it's going through the middle of the ocean. So now let's look at plant global biodiversity, because remember, we classify our biomes based on the vegetation in terrestrial ecosystems. Tropical rainforests harbor the highest number of plant species, and in general, the amount of plant diversity tails off towards the poles. So you could see this here. Here's our Amazon rainforest, and it has the darkest green color representing our highest amount of plant diversity. This area here has been developed by humans, so we have a lower level of biodiversity than we do in the rest of the Amazon. And you can see as we go to the North Pole or the South Pole, our rates of plant biodiversity are decreasing. Deserts have particularly low plant diversity, which is a pattern linked to their low primary productivity. Mediterranean climates, which are temperate regions with dry summers and wet winters, can actually support a large number of plants. So some examples of these Mediterranean climates are found along the southern tip of Africa, where you can see here we have a higher amount of plant biodiversity. In southwestern Australia, so we see that here, and in the Mediterranean Sea on the southern coast of Europe. So you can see here how it's darker green than in other parts of Europe. These regions show that additional factors only indirectly linked to climate influence regional plant diversity, including habitat diversity. So for example, in the Mediterranean regions, there's a mixture of different habitats such as woodlands, savannas, and grasslands, and frequent fires, which then change the biodiversity of the plants based on the fire season. So now let's look at animal biodiversity. This particular map is for mammalian diversity, but overall, mammals, birds, insects, and most other animals show very similar patterns of species diversity. And just to get a sense of animal diversity in tropical regions, I of course have to use insects for the example. One survey found more than 700 species of leaf beetles in the Amazon in a small set of trees, which is the number equal to the total diversity of leaf beetles in all of eastern North America. So that just shows you how high the biodiversity is in the Amazon and other tropical rainforests compared to in more deciduous climates that have more seasonality. For another example, a single tree in the Amazon harbored 43 species of ants, which exceeds all the total species of ants known to be found in Great Britain. 43 species of ants on one tree. So cool. Species diversity generally peaks near the equator and declines towards the poles, and this pattern is known as the latitudinal diversity gradient. There's a few different hypotheses for why this might be the case. Tropical biomes tend to be older, having evolved over tens of millions of years, whereas biomes at higher latitude have been shaped by climatic change and ultimately an ice age within the past few million years. So they've gone through a lot more change, and so the organisms there have a higher rate of extinction and evolution. Because tropical habitats have existed much longer than temperate ones, biologists hypothesize that there's been more time for species to diversify into specific niches. Whereas in higher altitudes, that's not necessarily the case. And they think this because species living at higher altitudes have adapted to a greater range of conditions on average than those near the equator. So in higher latitudes, there's been less division or resource partitioning in species. So species in higher altitudes tend to have greater geographical ranges than tropical species. You're not going to find 43 species of ants living on a tree in Kentucky, but you would in the rainforest. Another hypothesis is that temperate communities have fewer species because it's relatively difficult to adapt successfully to cold, dry winters and the range of weather typically experienced at higher latitudes. So that's another hypothesis. So just like plants, you can see we have a higher diversity of mammals and other animals at the equator, and then as you move to the poles, you have lower levels of diversity. Interestingly though, if we look at the Sahara Desert, for example, there's actually more species there than you would think would exist. So there's more mammalian species in the Sahara Desert than there are up in the very cold Arctic places near the North Pole or on Antarctica, which is interesting because if we go back to our plant diversity, we see that in the Sahara Desert, our plant diversity is just as low as it is in our very cold polar regions. So mammals have figured out ways to adapt to live in the Sahara Desert when many plant species have not. So we have more species occurring that are mammalian compared to plants. Biodiversity hotspots occur predominantly in tropical to subtropical environments. And biodiversity hotspots are biogeographic regions that are both a significant reservoir of biodiversity and is threatened by destruction. To be considered a biodiversity hotspot, you need to have a wide range of plants and animals. 2.3% of the planet's land surface contains 50% of the world's plant species and 42% of all terrestrial vertebrate species. And we won't even guess how many invertebrate species there are because so many have not been discovered yet. Because so many organisms and so many species are found in such a small part of the small region of the planet, it's really important to protect these biodiversity hotspots. So you can see in this map that all of these areas that are colored in red or orange or yellow, or if it's an aquatic region that are circled, those are the 34 or 35 biodiversity hotspots that are trying to be protected. The reason that these predominantly tropical, but not always, tropical communities have a high number of endemic species. An endemic species is a species that's native to a certain place. It's only found one place in the world and nowhere else. So some examples of some endemic species are these three organisms. So you will find a lot of endemic species on islands because remember we talked about colonization of islands can be very challenging. But once you get there, you typically have low levels of competition and you have a lot of different resources so organisms can have resource partitioning and become new species over time. So for example, on the island of Madagascar, that is the only place in the world where you find lemurs. And there's many different species of lemurs, but they're endemic or only found on the island of Madagascar. Islands are not the only places that you find endemic species. For example, this is the Baikal seal, which is only found in one lake in Russia. So what happened is the ocean used to go to the lake, but then the ocean receded and these seals actually were stranded at this lake. So they're not able to get to another aquatic habitat because there's land surrounding them. Another example of an endemic species is this stalk-eyed fly, because of course I had to have an insect. And this fly is found, this species of fly is only found on one mountain in Malaysia at a high elevation. So this fly cannot get to other habitats because it would have to move through areas of low elevation where it would not survive. Stalk-eyed flies are really cool. So it's really important to protect these biodiversity hotspots because in these regions, there's many species that are not found anywhere else on our planet. So if we lose that habitat, we lose that species. All right, another question. Climate has been proposed to play a role in the latitude diversity gradient. Specifically, some have hypothesized that A, the warm climate of the tropics promotes high speciation rates. B, the warm climate of the tropics promotes niche diversification. C, relatively few species are able to adapt to the harsher, more variable climates of the high latitudes. Or D, the harsh, more variable climates of high latitudes reduce speciation rates. So pause the video and answer the fifth question below. All right, one more question for today. In which biome would you expect to find the greatest diversity of insects? A, desert, B, deciduous forest, C, savanna, D, tropical rainforest, or E, tundra. So pause the video and answer the last question below. All right, and that's it for today. So remember, if you have any questions, you can post them on the discussion board, email me, or attend the Zoom office hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays. And don't forget to submit your clicker questions below. And here's a really cool ecosystem. It's a seagrass ecosystem, and here is a manatee eating some seagrass. They're also known as sea cows. I think they're adorable, so I wanted you to see an adorable animal, and I hope you have a great day.